Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started to make most of our time here. I am Suzanne Wunz, the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library, and on behalf of the library, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you all for coming for today's book talk and discussion of The Globalization of Healthcare edited by Professor Glenn Cohen, Professor of Law here and also co-director of the Petrie-Flom Center of Health Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. And I would also like to thank the Petrie-Flom Center as well as the Harvard Global Health Institute for co-sponsoring today's talk. And I would also like to thank the Dean's Office for providing the refreshments in the back, and I hope you all will enjoy those. And to Jude Casey, who's the Librarian for Open Access and Scholarly Communications at the library and who coordinated today's talk. So with all those thanks out of the way, I'll just add that today's panel is being taped. So if you ask any questions, which I hope you will, they will be part of the audio recording. And with that, I will hand it over to Einar Alhaig, who will be moderating today's talk.
Welcome to everybody. So my job really is to introduce the panelists and let them talk and then call on you guys. So we have an all-star panel today, starting with our own Glenn Cohen, Professor of Law here at Harvard Law School, Director of the Petrie-Flom Center in Health Law Policy, Bioethics, and Biotechnology, and one of the world's leading scholars in health law and bioethics. And most important today, the editor of this book that we're here to celebrate. So that's Glenn over on the far side. We also have Sue Goldie, the Roger Irving Lee Professor of Public Health at Harvard Public Health School and Professor of Global Health and Social Science at Harvard Medical School. Also a director, she's director of the Center for Health Decision Science, one of the world's leading scholars on evidence-based policy to reduce global health inequities and to address other public health issues, and a winner of the MacArthur Genius Grant. Then we also have Neil Shah, assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, founder and executive director of Costs of Care. Being a director is apparently a cost of admission to this group. Cost of Care is an independent, grant-supported nonprofit that helps patients and caregivers to deflate their medical bills. And he is both a practicing doctor, an obstetrician, and also a researcher on the role of frontline clinicians in improving healthcare safety and value. And I am a med school dropout who found out that law school was much more to my liking, so I switched over, and I've been enthusiastic about law in lots of areas, including health law policy, ever since. So are we going in this order? So we're going to start with some comments, both by the editor of the book and then by our distinguished panelists, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So take it away, Glenn.
Thank you, Einar. I will say that the med school world's loss has been our wonderful gain, so it's so nice to have you introduce us. So let me tell you a little bit about the book. That's my job here, and then we'll hear more thoughts about the book. This book arose out of a conference we did at the Petrie-Flom Center. I think it was 3 years ago we did it. Healthcare expenditures in the U.S. are rising all the time. They're currently about 18% of the GDP. That's expected to rise dramatically as the population ages. If healthcare costs continue to grow at historical rates, the share of GDP devoted to healthcare will be about 34% in 2040. For households with employer-sponsored health insurance, the trend means progressively smaller fraction of total compensation will be in the form of take-home pay, and a larger fraction of each paycheck will be about your employer-provided health insurance. The rising share of health expenditures also has dire implications for government budgets. Almost half of the current healthcare spending is covered by federal, state, and local governments in the U.S. If healthcare continues to grow at historical rates, Medicare and Medicaid spending will rise to nearly 15% of the GDP in 2040. And of this increase, about 1/4 is estimated to be due to the aging of the population and other demographic effects, whereas 3/4 is about the rising cost of care, something Neil and Sue both, and Arden for that matter, all write about. The ACA, if it works, is going to change these numbers, we hope. But really what I want to urge in this book, and what this book is about, is thinking about healthcare like other products. In 1817, David Ricardo, the British economist, had one of the most important insights in history, the theory of comparative advantage. The idea is that there's a fundamental argument in favor of free trade among countries and of specialization among individuals. Ricardo argued that there is mutual benefit from trade or exchange, even if one party, the resource-rich country, the highly skilled artisan, if you will, is more productive in every possible area, as long as each concentrates on the activities where it has relative productivity advantage. That theory has been put to work in most aspects of our lives. The shoes we wear, the food we eat, the iPads we type on. I'm going to adjust my shoe as I read a little bit more. One second. These ones are a bit tight, but they were so
He just
nice.
wants to show off.
Exactly.
The shoes.
Just,
That's
saying,
the
yeah.
whole point.
Just for the camera, that's important, right? Fashion is very important. It's the devil wears Prada moment, right? Almost everything we do has become globalized in one form or another. So the question this book asks is, what happens if healthcare becomes increasingly globalized? What are the legal and ethical issues? And again, there's distributive consequences here, but there's also opportunity. The book has recently been released by Oxford University Press, The Globalization of Healthcare, Legal and Ethical Issues. We have some copies there. We can have the Vanna White treatment, pass it around if someone wants to take a look. It's also available on Amazon for those of you watching at home, right? It examines whether health insurance should become a more globalized good and what the implications of doing so are. And again, to be very clear, we're already moving in this direction. What we did is we got together 25 leading academics, law, medicine, philosophy, business, public health, economics from across the globe to examine these questions. And the book really has 5 parts. I'm just going to walk you through them briefly. The first is on medical tourism, the idea of patients who travel abroad for the primary purpose of getting health care. They go from a home country to a destination country, often to save healthcare costs or to get something that's unavailable at home. Although the studies come to widely different conclusions about the size of this population, there have been some estimates. Deloitte thought in 2007 there were about 750,000 US medical tourists. Another estimate in 2010 said that there are 952,000 Californians alone, roughly half of whom are Mexican immigrants, traveling to Mexico for medical care, dental care, prescription drug in a given year. Looking more globally, in 2004, more than 150,000 foreigners sought medical treatment in India, a 25% increase from prior years. In Malaysia in 2004, they saw 130,000 foreign patients. Bumrungrad, the industry leader in Bangkok, Thailand, which looks mostly like a 4-star conference hotel more than anything else, more than a hospital. It saw 400,000 patients that were foreigners in 2005. And the revenues here really are staggering. Cuba got 40 million from the trade, Malaysia 27.6 million, Jordan 500 million, and it's estimated that in India this trade is worth $2.2 billion. So the chapters in this section of the book, including one by me, examine a few questions. First, we've got an in-depth examination of 20-something reported cases of individuals who've gone primarily to the Dominican Republic and that part of the world for cosmetic and bariatric surgery and died actually in the course of that, and what lessons can be learned about accreditation, safety, and the like. Another chapter looks at inter-EU medical tourism, where we have a robust jurisprudence from the European courts on when member states have to pay for travel to other member states, and a new directive on the matter that's going to be transposed later this year. We have another chapter looking at the way the media covers medical tourism and what can be learned about that, and particularly the gaps. We've got a chapter looking about how the Affordable Care Act will affect medical tourism and also the insurer side of this. For example, whether plans incorporating medical tourism can be incorporated onto the exchanges. We have another chapter by me looking at the effects on destination healthcare access. So yes, all these Americans and other Westerners are going abroad. There's also South-South and North-North and South-North flow. But what is the effect on the domestic availability of healthcare for the destination country poor? Is this leading to more migration out of the public sector into the private sector? Is this leading to more public health spending being redirected? We have chapters on things that are illegal at home, so cross-border reproductive care services and some of the thorny immigration and other issues it raises. Chapters on assisted suicide tourism from the UK to Switzerland, as well as travel to abortions. And chapters on stem cell therapies primarily being offered in East Asia, and the role of home country physicians in advising patients what to do, in particular pediatric patients. That's one part of the book. The next part of the book looks at medical worker migration, the so-called brain drain of physicians and other care practitioners, largely from the developing to the developed world. Now, the United States itself heavily depends on foreign-trained doctors to staff its healthcare system. In 2005, about a fifth of all doctors practicing in the US were foreign-trained. And this recruitment has had serious effects on the supply of doctors in the developing world. For example, between 86 and 95, 61% of all graduates of the Ghana Medical School left their country for employment elsewhere. Most of those in the United Kingdom, but about a third of them in the United States. The effect of this migration on rich and poor nations is immense. A recent study estimated that roughly 3 million currently practicing healthcare professionals trained in less developed countries had migrated to more developed countries, and it would have cost $184,000 per professional to train them in the more developed world. So that poor countries are losing about $500 million worth of investment, and wealthy countries are standing to gain about $552 billion in this dynamic. The chapters in this part of the book look at how home, destination country governments, international bodies, hospitals can work together to develop best practices for the ethical recruitment of physicians, whether destination countries can ethically put limits through conditional scholarship offers on their own doctors, requiring them to stay in the country for a large number of years, like 10 years or 15 years in their practice. The role of international health law policy, so-called soft law, particularly at the WHO, in trying to solve this problem. The third part of the book is about the globalization of research and development. So about $39 billion spent by pharmaceutical companies in 2004. Of those, about 21% was spent outside the United States, so a very large share. By one estimate in 2005, approximately 40% of all clinical trials were being run in the developing countries, while projections of this number would increase to 50 to 70% of all trials being run outside of the United States in the near future. In the developing world, we've got huge populations who continue to suffer from diseases that are readily preventable. Those include 611,000 deaths per year from measles, 1.7 million from diarrhea, 155,000 from syphilis. While neglected diseases account for 16.4% of the global disease burden, only 2 to 3% of global research and development expenditures go to research directed on those diseases, at least in part because just 1.5% of the 16.4%, or 0.25% overall, of the total global burden of disease takes place in the developed world, whereas the pharmaceutical industry earns about 95% of its revenue from the developed world. So there's a real mismatch here that is an ethical concern to many. The chapters in this part of the book examine whether access to information about clinical trials, safety and effectiveness of drugs, medical devices should be recognized as a fundamental component of a right to health, and whether this link should be used to promote the establishment of solid knowledge creation systems based on transparent data. Another chapter looks at the potential for ATS, Alien Tort Statute liability, for research ethics malfeasance abroad, including a case in Kenya, Nigeria. Another chapter looks at the politics and regulation of the sharing of influenza vaccine strains, prompted in part by a 2007 controversy that occurred when Indonesia, a world leader in the transmission of novel animal flu strains from animals to humans, briefly stopped sharing its flu strains with the WHO, and the panic that ensued, and to think about equitable sharing and how we can make sure that the countries that are sharing get something back. Another chapter looks at the ways in which regulations pertaining to data exclusivity and patent linkage that are rapidly being adopted in the developing world can stand in the way of access to essential medicines. And the last chapter in this section looks at antibiotic resistance. It's an unusual and counterintuitive market where we need to give economic incentives not to produce the product or consume the product, but to avoid wasting these precious products. So it examines the possibility of prize systems and other mechanisms to deal with antibiotic resistance. The fourth part of the book is about telemedicine. Patients stay put, but the doctors are elsewhere. Like medical tourism, it also has the potential to radically reconfigure the geography of healthcare services. This ranges everything from image interpretation, teleradiology, telepathology, teleretinology, to something much more technologically sophisticated like cyber surgery and robotic surgery remotely, as well as office-based telemedicine like telepsychiatry and teleradiology. So for a U.S. hospital to engage in the low-end teleradiology, that can be bought for about $150,000 a machine to let you do that. If you want to do robotic surgical instruments, you're going to need to spend about $1 million with additional harder to quantify expenses relating to technicians and the like. Telemedicine already has a major hold on the US economy. A 2005 estimate suggests that roughly half of all US hospitals outsourced some of their radiology services through telemedicine. And India has been the major beneficiary here. It has received about $864 million in 2005 for diagnostic testing export, and that's estimated to have grown about 20% per annum since then. The chapters in this part of the book look at globalization's effect on modern IT-driven healthcare, not only telemedicine, but also medical records and medical databases, the possibility of enhancing the globalization of affordable, high-quality healthcare through stronger commitments to IT exploitation, and also chapters about the obstacles faced here by the regulatory regime, right? So the ideas of licensing, the ideas of different standards of practice, and the question about whether a combination of public and private approaches can redress these shortcomings, focusing on a national US regime for telemedicine with built-in public and private dispute resolution mechanisms through ADR. The last portion of this book looks more theoretically at governance and justice caused by this globalization. One chapter by Jennifer Ruger talks about shared health governance as a theory of global health governance, rooted in the political theory of provincial globalism, an idea of an obligation to reduce shortfalls and inequalities and address threats to central capabilities. A much more historical chapter tries to root the problem in all things the mid-1800s work of Friedrich Engels and Rudolf Virchow, and try to build a discussion of the social determinants of health out of that history, and try to root it in Madison Powers and Ruth Faden's models and bioethics of social justice and ethical framework. And the last chapter of the book reaches deeply into philosophical thinking to answer the question, what kind of right is the international right to healthcare that is put forth in legal documents like the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of 1966? It argues that it's a mistake to view the right to health as reflecting a single moral principle and suggests at least two moral principles. One, a moral duty to respect the sanctity of life. Second, a basic political right to health care against one's own government, whenever such a government exercises jurisdiction over persons and territory. And the content of that right, the author argues, parallels perhaps a general obligation to establish a system of civil and criminal justice in your country. So that is the contents of the book. I hope you'll read it. As LeVar Burton would say, don't take my word for it, read all about it. But before we hear you get to read all about it, let me turn the floor over to our two generous commentators.
Professor Shaw, would you like to go next?
I'm still reeling from how impressively comprehensive that book is. Of course, you'd expect no less from Glenn. Which I think one of my favorite things about the book is that the introduction appropriately outlines how the book is organized and why it's organized that way. And then Glenn explains how he could have organized it completely differently, how he could have wrangled all this really complex information differently. So let me just start by thanking Glenn for inviting me and congratulating Glenn on what's clearly a very important book, at least from my perspective as a sort of forward-deployed healthcare worker in an increasingly globalized delivery system. I think I'll keep my remarks brief, both because I'm surrounded by very esteemed panelists and because I'm a forward-deployed healthcare worker. I'm in my 36th hour awake after spending the night in the operating room, so I'm struggling a little bit. But I think probably the way that I can contribute best to this conversation is by maybe starting off by giving an account of how globalization in healthcare has sort of impacted my own practice, both in terms of sending out and receiving medical tourists, as a way of underscoring, I think, the importance and immediacy and relevance of this book. And then maybe just saying a few words at a high level about what medical tourism in particular implies for patient risk and safety, our collective social responsibility, both ethically and legally in protecting patients from harm, and also where maybe there's some opportunities to improve the value of healthcare. So interestingly, in 2006, I took a sojourn for medical school. I came back in the end, but I found my way through the Petrie Flom Center, learning from Einar and Glenn, also at the Kennedy School of Government, studying the politics of healthcare reform, where I was very specifically taught that healthcare in the United States is local. That was sort of like a dogmatic belief. I was actually taught that healthcare, like education, is one of those things that people are almost irrationally loyal to. The hospital down the street, just like they're almost irrationally loyal to the school down the street, no matter what apparent deficits there might be in quality. And this is sort of the lens through which I viewed healthcare reform both in Massachusetts and nationally. And then immediately after hanging out with Glenn and Einar, I took a deep dive into residency, where I spent 80 to 100 hours a week inside of 3 of Boston's biggest tertiary academic medical centers, not only huge referral centers, but also places with international reputations. And interestingly, these hospitals were the sort of neighborhood hospital for a lot of people in the community that lived down the street. But they were also places that I think, for a variety of reasons, saw 3 different kinds of medical tourists. This is sort of how I think of them. Essentially, medical tourism is about access, and there's kind of 3 kinds of access. There's access in terms of affordability. So these would be, I'm an OBGYN, by the way, so these would be and these are not exceptional examples, these are completely routine. So these are my Dominican patients who would time their abdominoplasty with their last baby and sort of fly home to the DR. And interestingly, it's not the wealthy patients that come to see residents. It's sort of the down and out. These are like the Mission Hill residents that don't have a lot of money, but would choose to spend it to go back to the Dominican Republic and undergo cosmetic surgery. Many of the surgeries are the types of surgeries that are outlined in one of the first chapters in the book that sort of talk about the media accounts of some of the potential harms. So there's the affordability access issue. There's kind of the, for lack of a better word, expediency issue. So this is the queue jumping. Sometimes in countries that are more socialized, you have to wait a little bit to get your hip replaced, like our neighbors to the north, which I think Glenn hails from.
And my mother had a hip replacement in the U.S. She became a medical tourist actually to avoid queue jumping.
So there's just 2 buckets. And then the third is actually one of the more interesting. And again, I don't have a great word for it, but it's sort of like the opportunistic kind of access. It's people that are trying to either access a technology that doesn't exist in their home country. So these are my patients, usually from oil-rich countries in the Middle East, who come over for salvage therapies at the end of life, like the proton beam at Mass General. There are people accessing reproductive technologies, also within my field, because they may be illegal in their home country, another subject that the book touches on at length. And then there's this sort of third category that's really interesting to me that the book doesn't quite touch on, but these are people that are accessing kind of like a set of rights that come along with receiving care in a given setting. So, I don't know if any of you have ever received care in another country. I feel like maybe I just get these stories a lot, but, I've got friends that tell me that they got really sick or injured in Europe, and they tell me all about how their emergency care experience was very different from what they'd come to expect here. A much more potent example might be the patients that I see frequently, or relatively frequently, that are actually coming here to deliver babies. They're actually coming to access citizenship. So, there's really a broad range of types of medical tourists and also motivations for why they would come in the first place. So maybe I'll just say a couple of brief words about some of the concerns with this. The first might be that we have very little information about what's happening on a sort of macro level in terms of medical tourism. Considerable limitations to the data, to the point that the best sort of empirical review of what's going on are 2 chapters that review media reports. And in fact, I think one of the chapters describes two leading consulting companies talking about the volume. And Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like between Deloitte and McKinsey, there's like a 2 order of magnitude difference in the amount of medical tourists that they estimate that are U.S. citizens that go. Is that about right?
That's right.
Yeah. So clearly we have very little idea of what's going on. And so when you don't know who the medical tourists are, it's really hard to link outcome data. And so when you're trying to ensure the safety of a system, the first most robust way to do it would be to look at outcome data in a rigorous way. Another way that I think Glenn mentioned in the introduction is to look at standardization requirements, which are technically easier to achieve, but operationally very difficult to impose, even in our own country. And then the third way might be public reporting of adverse events, which is sort of the simplest way. And something that I think one or two of the authors in the book propose, that some of our sort of government agencies might do in a kind of rudimentary watchdog fashion. Like this, the State Department and the CDC already kind of report on health hazards from travel, and maybe they ought to report on this. The second concern is, once you have that kind of data, you want to be able to give people reasonably accurate assessments of their risk. And again, this is something that's incredibly challenging to do in our own country. So even when you have a floor of standardization, it's not clear to me that the, Kuwaiti sheik that's traveling over to Mass General for, a salvage cancer treatment is somehow protected against the harms of medical tourism, or even the false advertising that sometimes comes along with medical tourism, because often they're seeking therapies that bear risks and that are relatively unproven. So maybe I'll just sort of leave it at that. And
Let me just say, before Sue goes on, that we do have some seats over here. People do want to sit down in the back. You can also sit on the stairs over here. I don't want everybody to have to stand. We can turn around some of these chairs over here and make room for people.
Maybe I'll actually add just one more thought. So another theme in the book that is of particular interest is how the Affordable Care Act might impact this phenomenon of medical tourism. And you might think at first blush the idea of the Affordable Care Act is to expand access. And so one of the theoretical drivers of medical tourism is affordability, and that maybe there'd be less incentive for people to go abroad. And actually, this is quite interesting that for several reasons that might not be the case. Expanding coverage is the same thing as improving affordability. So what we found in Massachusetts is that actually expanding coverage led to more price sensitivity, because more people are in high deductible health plans, and when you're taking the first $5,000 on the chin, it makes you think a little bit more about how you're spending your money. And then sort of the other piece of it is that as we seek to cover more people using less money, it may become increasingly attractive for health plans to consider foreign providers in the mix. And that's of particular interest to me, because I wonder how that might actually change the responsibility of the payer and sort of guaranteeing the safety of the providers that they're participating with. Typically, the health insurance plan that you have doesn't really bear any responsibility or liability for the doctors that are giving you care, but it might change if they have to make certain guarantees to induce people to use these less costly providers, and that might actually provide a solution that might help drive value. So,
Thank you very much, Professor Gould.
So, thank you for fellow panelists. Congratulations on your book. Sorry you didn't go to medical school, but you probably made the right choice. I'm Sue Goldie, and there's a number of perspectives I could talk to you about from this book. And as a decision scientist, as a physician, as a public health researcher, probably as a mom with 2 teenage boys, but we won't go there. But what I thought I would do is try to take a broader perspective and talk to you from the vantage point of my role as the faculty director of the Harvard Global Health Institute. And given that health is such a focus of this book, and it was also the genesis of me meeting Glenn, I thought that might be useful. So one of the, for those of you that don't know about the Institute, it was established by President Faust a couple of years ago, and it's labeled as its mission is to, an educational mission, to build and strengthen the emerging field of global health. In short, what I like to say, if I only had 2 seconds, is it's to create a paradigm shift, to catalyze a paradigm shift in terms of the way we think about health, not as the absence of disease, but as some broader notion of well-being or capability, and also of global health. We've talked a lot about what global means here, and you can infer it from both the summary of the book as well as, reading the inside jacket. But let me step back and describe to you 4 clusters of changes that motivate that paradigm shift. And this very much has to do with my 2 basic comments about the book. So those 4 clusters of changes, 1, the world's changing. All right, so broadly speaking, we've already mentioned some of the forces of globalization, both positive and negative, and interdependence. Glenn talks about this in several ways in the final part of the book. But I wanted to point out there's a kind of a set of global risks that we all face and a set of global opportunities. And those risks are relevant to the legal sector, they're relevant to the health sector, they're relevant to all sectors. So example, the global power shifts or geopolitical conflict or environmental and climate change and the displaced populations. Social and economic inequalities, weak governance, weak institutions. Those are some of the big global risks that all have health dimensions to them, but they also are of relevance to every sector. The opportunity side, there's lots of new technologies mentioned in this book, and also we can think of all of the miniaturization and nanotechnology, areas of physical science and material science, systems analysis and thinking. Really every discipline you can think of, there's been progress at the boundary. The relative proportion, the impact of those big risks will hit the worst off. And those opportunities without intervention often benefit disproportionately the best off. So the challenges are not only how do we face these challenges, and including, I'm obviously thinking about the health lens, so mitigating those challenges, but also how we leverage the opportunities in a way that provides more equitable balance and distribution of the risks and benefits. So that's the first cluster that catalyzes a paradigm shift. The second cluster is probably pretty known to everyone. It's population dynamics. So we've got 3 big firsts, right? This is the first time ever that the older population is bigger than the younger population, and that's a manifestation of declining mortality rates. So we're facing aging in many places in the world as a major population boom. Another first is that we have, for the first time ever, on average, more people living in urban areas than rural. So this urbanization and movement of people is another big population shift. Third, declining fertility rates. And so overall, on average, even though the average number of children each woman has shouldn't be averaged at all, but is 2, and that's replacement fertility. Really big change. But that's heterogeneous, and some countries are battling with diminishing workforce in terms of their age structure, but other countries are dealing with almost half of the population being under the age of 18. And so very large changes in our demographic age structure and our population that has big implications for health, but also for many of the dimensions that come up in this book. The third cluster that's motivating this paradigm shift is that the patterns of health are changing. And so superimposed on that demographic shift are epidemiologic changes. In short, that global transfer of risk, the fact that everything moves across border, people, tools, technologies, knowledge, bad things, good things, etc., has led to an escalation of risk factors for chronic disease. Leading killer right now is cardiovascular disease. So the nature of what we die from and when we die from those diseases or get sick from those diseases has changed. more kind of poignantly, when we think about big challenges, these are layered. So we don't really live in a developed and a developing world anymore. We live in one world with a heterogeneous group of people living in countries, many of the poorest displaced out of a nation state. And so it's a complicated sort of universe we're all in. Those changing disease distributions in most lower and middle income countries are creating what we call a double burden. There's still an unfinished agenda where some of the neglected diseases Glenn mentioned are a problem, but everywhere there's this rising burden of injuries and chronic diseases. That portfolio is going to require responses, societal responses, from far more than just medicine, but from a range of disciplines. The final cluster that I want you to think about as causing this paradigm shift need is that of the position of health. And I think we're sitting in a law school, so this is an example where why is health a topic of a book with like an uncountable number of chapters and pages, FYI, I might add, having to have read the whole thing. Yeah. But that position of health, health is no longer the purview of the health sector only. Whether we think back to early 90s when the World Bank made health a major development focus, all the way to the fact that health can be framed as foreign policy, as relevant to security, as relevant to the human rights agenda. Health is really everyone's business, and the health sector has slowly but finally realized that much of health is determined by social determinants and the distribution of those determinants. And so the answers for what we can do, the levers we can move to create a healthier, strong society, come from both mitigating many of the risks, seizing the opportunities, both of which have been mentioned, but also comes from thinking about societal responses to health problems in a much broader way. Within that paradigm shift, what we think of these as all the way, I say on the left, just because I think of this as a broad spectrum, research, development, discovery of new things, delivering health services through a national health system, through communities, through other countries' systems or communities, social policy, innovation outside the health sector, and then the whole sphere of global governance, either global governance for health or governance in other sectors that influence health. Again, all of these have been touched on in places in this book. Those big four clusters and this paradigm shift kind of force us to think about global health and the issues related to the global part of that and the health part in a way that doesn't allow for separation of conditions, social determinants, and responses. And I would offer you that within that conceptual paradigm, I won't talk more about it, there is almost no location that there is not some topic in this book that touches on. So I wanted to, restrict my first set of comments to that notion of this broader conceptual foundation. The second piece, though, is what does that mean? That broad foundation and those multiplex of problems. Well, for us, both as scholars sitting at the table, as researchers, as concerned citizens, and as the Institute director, it means we need to think about new kinds of leaders and new kinds of knowledge. And in terms of new kinds of leaders, that's going to require global health leaders, global leaders that value health, leaders that are informed about health, and an educated citizenry. And that's going to require a transformation in how we teach, what we teach, and who we teach to. More relevant to this discussion is new knowledge. And the kinds of problems that are the topics in these books and the kinds of problems that really are the big social issues of the 21st century are going to require knowledge from many different disciplines. I nicknamed the day I met Glenn this as the white space, the interdisciplinary white space. He's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, it's the stuff that there's generally not a chapter about, although now he's proven me wrong. It lives between, and the work will happen between those spaces. So that's going to require a real shift in what we work on, how we work, and who we work with. And in that vein, the idea of producing knowledge together across disciplines, across geographical locations, across sectors, incentivizing relevancy to those questions are all really the hot issues of how we have to think as a university. And so I wanted to close with 4 points that were my observations about the book that aren't topical, but that are more kind of broad musings, so to speak. And I wrote these down so I would not forget them. So there were 4 things. I thought each of these is something you should be congratulated for. However, there's a but at the end, but they're also very relevant to each of us. So one is the idea of relevancy. We all know the guy over there is pretty rigorous. You know, he couldn't hang out here for that long if he wasn't. So he's rigorous. But it's relevancy and rigor that we need as we move forward. And one of the additions to that I thought of as I plowed through this thing, now that I'm getting a little more informal, long book, is intentional scholarship. And so intentional scholarship is it's not only relevant, it's you're seeking out those issues that are so important to today and so important to the problems that we can anticipate in the next 50 years. Intentional scholarship. The second is it's more than asking the right questions. It's how we frame them. And it's framing those questions in a very diverse, open, scholarly way that invites ethical perspectives, that is not looking at people moving in one direction, but what's happening in both directions, that I also think is an attribute of the kinds of scholarship that we need to be doing. The third is that it's more than just a book or a product, a public good, but it's the process that was undertaken to arrive at this product. And that process, which, as briefly mentioned, started 3 years ago, is what we try to do at the institutes to create a hub where there are some intellectual scaffolding. And again, I joked to Glenn when I met him, if we're not uncomfortable in a room together with the people there as we talk about a problem, we probably don't have the right people in the room. So for the problems of today, it means we use different languages. I don't know what half the legal terms in this book mean. You know, I was struggling with my little dictionary. It's I don't need to understand everything. But the idea that to kind of live in a space where there's some discomfort in how we explain things to each other, allow us to frame our questions in ways that invite more global solutions. And the final point I'll make is he chose problems that are hard to study and impossible to solve. There is no conclusion in any chapter. And that's really difficult for a scholar who wants to feel good at something and like you've accomplished something. But there's a lesson in that understandings that are substantive, but that also allow for continued intellectual engagement is the only way we're going to be able to tackle the big social problems. For global health in particular, this is really a non-starter. So I want to congratulate you on the book. Forgive me for not talking about the detail. I could argue about so many things in there, so we can schedule a date. But I thought this broader perspective is both a tremendous compliment to you, Glenn, but it also really invites us all to think about how our scholarship will change over the next 20 to 50 years. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So I think I'll ask a question to start, and I'll take a cue here. So, Glenn, you started out with Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which is a great theory. But as you were all talking about the developments in healthcare, I wondered whether they didn't challenge one of the implicit premises of Ricardo's theory, which is that some resources actually belong to a relatively static within a country. So in a world where a lot of the physicians, in fact, move to another country, but that even if you restrict that, the patients go into that country and could deflect them from treating their own native citizens to treating the foreign tourists, or where they even might be practicing telemedicine in the United States, even though they're abroad. Does that change that, and does change Ricardo's theory? So, I mean, like one concrete example, I'm thinking if you're in Bombay and you treat nothing other than U.S. tourists, or actually tourists from all across the world, and you also do telemedicine, and you even do cyber surgery, does your location matter? And is that a comparative advantage for India at that point, or you just, are all the doctors going to become global citizens because of the decreasing costs that providing healthcare? We're basically unbundling the location of the physician and the location of the patient in important ways.
That's a great and deep question. Let me answer it by reference to a 90s musical album by Jamiroquai called Traveling Without Moving, which Virtual Insanity, one of my favorite songs, is on that album, right? One of the things he's talking about is traveling without moving, right? This idea that these vectors are happening. So a couple of answers. One is I do definitely think it puts pressure on territoriality as the basis for legislation. And other work I've done elsewhere by people traveling to get illegal things like abortion, assisted suicide in their home country that's touched on by some of the chapters in this book. I talk about the notion of a citizenship relationship and that the difference between thinking about the power to legislate and the power of sovereignty based on citizenship as a political theory as opposed to based on territoriality and presence in a territory. And one of the things I think that's interesting here is it challenges the notion that territoriality is important as a form of legislation or a form of prescription, so on one level. On another level, I think the interrelationship of these different ways in which globalization happens is very interesting. So one positive story that's sometimes told about India, about medical tourism in India, is it's actually a solution to medical migration because many people who would have wanted to travel to the US to have a high-tech, high remuneration practice experience can now stay put in India or return to India, and this story of brain circulation. As my chapter in this book and some other work I've done suggests, it's not clear that story is actually true. And even if it's true for a place like India, which is both a sender of patients for medical migration and a place where people go for medical tourism, there are other places like Ghana, for example, that's only a sender and not a place where it comes through. So we have these questions about the interrelationships between these things. But in a way, you're absolutely right, Einar, that these are in some senses substitutes and complements for one another, right? If you want, as from a physician perspective, if you want a high remuneration, high-tech practice experience, you could either move to the US, practice medicine there. You could either work for Apollo or one of the big hospitals and see patients in India, or you could stay in India and do telemedicine abroad, right, and deal with those kinds of cases. The same is true from the perspective of a patient who's deciding what to do. They could go to their local doctor in the US, who, statistically speaking, is very likely, if it's a resident, to actually be an Indian national who's doing residency here. You're not an Indian national, Indian ancestry, right? Or it could be, they could go and get teleradiology. They may not even know that their x-ray is being looked at in India or in Thailand or somewhere else. Or they could go abroad. And the choices we make in some ways as a structuring system is we have to think about both the efficiency gains for one mechanism over the other, but also the distributive impacts, and whether one form of globalization as a complement or a substitute for the other may have better distributive impacts, or whether instead they're exacerbating. So again, medical migration, medical tourism may solve medical migration to some extent in India, but it's going to increase interregional medical migration such that someone else is going to be hurt in a different country. So just to say the complexity, but I think you're right, that this is a world that Ricardo, I don't think, could have fathomed, because for him, products and services always had to travel, and now we're in a world where, in fact, they can stay put, and yet there's still this international component.
Just to add to that, not about the theory, no offense, but just practically, we're very focused in this book on healthcare and technology. I mean, that's some of the theme. I just want to differentiate health status and access to health care and technology. So Cuba has a lot less than us, but they have a more favorable infant mortality rate than the United States. There are many risks in the United States you wouldn't face in a hospital with equal care in another location. So one sort of thing to keep in mind, and I think many of the lessons and themes in the book are relevant to all of these, is that health, public health, prevention, promotion, and basic care is really outside the health sector, not the confines of only physicians, but a much larger array of health workers, which again raises many legal issues. And the second, the issue that even if healthcare was completely transportable and you could have people jump around, the idea that a country in this world is grappling with a health problem in that country is our problem, regardless of if we're going there or they're going there. The nature of health and the transport of risks is we actually need to care about capacity to deliver health everywhere for a variety of reasons.
All right, we got a question here?
So you bring up Ricardo, and to treat it, emphasize this notion that it's a product that you can trade and that there's advantages to trade. But I want to cite Arrow to say that it's not any kind of a good. We have monopolies created by patents, by professional societies, by education and licensing. You have monopsonies on the parts of governments or whatever the purchasing system is. And you have all sorts of information asymmetries between what the patient knows, what the provider knows, what the purchaser knows, what the regulator knows. And if you want to use this sort of Ricardian framework to say, well, this is a product that we want to trade, I'm concerned that the product is more easily tradable than the regulations or the structures that are used to mitigate those sources of potential market failure. And it's not just about regulatory schemes, it's not just about laws, it's about values in a certain sense. Colombia, which is where I'm from, I'm an MD PhD in health policy, by the way, is just starting to really put a lot of emphasis on ethics committees in research. And we're importing the Bellman report, and we did import the Helsinki Declaration a while ago, but it's not clear to me, or at least it seems to beg the question of why those are the standards we should be imposing. And I think Professor Sue, I'm sorry, comment about the paradigm shift, I think is what I'm getting at. But the question I want to ask is, who gets to set the new paradigm? And who should get to set it, and who is going to set it, and on what grounds should it be set, how should it be set, and what should we be concerned about if it doesn't get set by those actors under those conditions?
Thank you, Julian. It's a great question again. Let me just start off by being clear about Ricardo and what work he's doing here. This book is not the standard international trade kind of understanding of this, of the Ricardo model. Rather, to me, Ricardo is a challenge and to say, how come this took so long, right? Under my theory, we should have seen this long ago. We don't. How is this different, and how is it isomorphic from other goods? And I think most of the chapters in the book are addressing exactly that gap. In terms of regulation and monopolies and existing institutional players, I view the globalization, and particularly medical tourism and telemedicine, as real game changers and challengers to existing institutional lockups, right? In telemedicine in particular, one of the pressures is the state licensing of physicians and how that works when someone is abroad. So we see this real, I think, struggle between incumbents on the one hand, including incumbent insurers and incumbent hospitals in the US charging certain prices. There's a story about the Blue Ridge company, I think in North Carolina, that decided it was going to enable medical tourism to Singapore for all of its employees, self-insured employment plan. When it did this, there was a lot of outrage, but one of the things that happened, and this also is true with the Hannaford Brothers supermarket chain in New England that tried to do this, is the local insurer said, wait a second, don't do this. We're going to reduce our rates and try to make it your while to keep people here. Because I think these insurers are really afraid of what would happen if they had to compete, if their market to compete with was not other hospitals or other insurance companies, but was in fact across the world. Now, is that going to happen? Are Americans going to be radically outsourcing their interest? No. 25% of Americans, I think, is the ceiling of who has a passport right now. So that's a hard ceiling for traveling abroad. But in general, I think one of the things medical tourism does, and also telemedicine to some extent, is it reveals the edifice, and Neil writes a lot about costs of care and what's going on. It's very difficult in the US to find out what it will cost you if you're uninsured to get a particular procedure. When you do find out, you learn it's very, very high, but it's hard to get that information ahead of time, nearly impossible. When you do medical tourism, there is a price. There is a sticker price that's offered directly to you, and I think we're seeing some pressure of transparency here. In terms of who decides, I have a cynical answer and I have an ideal justice answer. I'll start with the ideal and move to the cynicism. The ideal justice answer is, on some theories of global justice, we should be accountable to the harms we're doing. These are our co-equal citizens. We may need a true global governance of the kind Jennifer Praruger talks about in her chapter. My cynical answer is that we're unlikely to get any traction. The WHO has not been successful in being a place, an edifice, for example, to get a lot done. I don't think we're going to get a global health treaty on medical tourism myself, or telemedicine, or any of these things. So I think in the realistic mid to near future, we're talking about both destination countries, foreign countries, and the home countries of patients to be the ones to make these kinds of decisions. And one of the things I urge in my chapter of the book, and the other chapters of the book, that we should ask them to at least take into account the interests of people abroad. While, on some theories of global justice, and maybe even ones that I would endorse, one would hope that they would go broader than that, maybe think of these people as co-equals. I would be satisfied if we move to a point where when the U.S. tries to decide its healthcare policy that'll have impacts on India, we at least count the interests of the Indian people for something, not for nothing. Do I think that's likely to happen? Again, not so much.
Anybody else before we move on? Next question? No? All right. Nicholson?
So I'm going to do something a little unusual, which is ask a question, suggest why I think my question might be unimportant, and then hope that I might be wrong. So my question, again, jumping off from Ricardo, is the concept of comparative advantage, I think classically has ideas where different people are good at doing different things, and they actually have different skills and different resources and things like that. Here it seems a lot more like the story is just poor versus rich, and that it's really about just North versus South and sending rich people to poor countries, or occasionally poor people to rich countries. I'm wondering, is that it? And if so, do we see that becoming actually a less important dynamic as poor countries get richer? The reason that might not be important is because it's going to take a really long time for poor countries to get richer, and so who cares? It's super relevant right now anyway. But I'm wondering, is there something I'm missing, and is there anything going on besides just poor and rich?
The answer is yes. So, first of all, let me say, we've talked mostly today about one particular slice of medical tourism, largely north-south, from rich to poor. Actually, it's a relatively recent development, historically speaking. Actually, medical tourism goes all the way back to the Roman baths. Back in the day, that was one of the first, you look at Steve McQueen, the famous actor, died in a clinic in Rosarito, Mexico, where he was trying to get Laetrile, which was not available as cancer treatment in the U.S. because it didn't work, actually. So there is a huge flow that's actually north-north. So from Canada, like my mother, to the U.S. Within the EU, there's a huge inter-EU. There's also a major south flow. So when I was in Malaysia, I sometimes go at the invitation of governments and see their hospitals, which is always kind of interesting. I don't know what they think. Me as a lawyer, it's going to be able to observe and learn from the hospitals, but it's very interesting. In Malaysia, for example, their main target is Indonesians. And they actually charge the Indonesians the same rate they charge the Malaysians. Their main goal is actually to increase the volume of people they get, because if they don't have enough population themselves, Indonesia is much bigger, to sustain the level of service they want. And so they want to have 3 trauma teams or 3 IVF teams. They need more people. And so they're spending all of this money trying to get Indonesians to come to Malaysia, even though the cost of healthcare is relatively similar. The other thing is that I don't want to paint this as though Americans are going somewhere for a cheaper but inferior product. In fact, many people are traveling for techniques that are not available in the U.S. or superior somewhere else. My mother traveled here because there's a method of a hip replacement, the Hanna table, that they don't do in Canada. In Cuba, there's well-known treatments for retinal pigmentosa. There's some dispute about whether they actually work or not, but that's not available in the U.S. Thailand has expertise in sex reassignment surgery that we don't have in the U.S. People travel there. So there is also an element of this that is shopping for quality. and also shopping for regulatory status. We talk about stem cell therapies going abroad for them, talk about traveling for abortion, traveling for that. So I think the picture is more complex. Now, all that said, though, there is a part of the discussion that is shopping for price. But the reason why India's healthcare is cheaper than the US's healthcare is not merely the fact that India is a poorer country than the US. There are also structural questions about the organization of the various healthcare systems that are important. And one of the reasons why I like Neil's work so much is he's asking those kinds of questions about the US. But the comparative examples I think could be interesting and very enlightening to understand what might be wrong with US healthcare system. What lessons can we learn from these other places, not merely as a place to send those our disenfranchised, our poor huddled masses who can't get treated here.
Yes, Sue?
I'll just add to that. I think, so I echo that. In addition, there's a huge wave of universal coverage. In many countries now are making this a political priority. And the innovation that we can expect over the next 10, 15 years to deliver efficient, high-value care, I think is considerably more promising outside the United States. And an anecdote is if we think of cervical cancer screening, what percentage of the costs of that very successful cancer screening is spent on stuff that's going to go away, meaning really inefficient wastage? About 97%. So we're so on the flat of the curve in many areas in the United States in terms of efficiency that as countries develop innovative, high-value ways to deliver, I mean, the hope is we would actually learn from them and fix our own system. But I think that this will increasingly become more and more muddied. Exploitation would be possible both within our own country and without those. Your question is relevant in that regard.
Just to give one more example, is that India has been a great source of what's sometimes called reverse innovation. I think that term is actually a bit pejorative. I don't like that term. But essentially there are things like, for example, a NICU, the equivalent of a NICU, an incubator that you can strap on your chest that will cost $10 to make, right? That could act as a substitute for the expensive technology to some extent that we use where it's unavailable. Dialysis, personal dialysis machines. So there's a huge amount of necessity being the mother of invention in places where high-tech care of the kind we like can't be afforded. And there's the possibility that some of this technology will be re-imported and revolutionize the way we see patients in the US if we can get away from our addiction to high-cost technology when there is a lower-cost substitute.
In the back in the vest.
Hi, congratulations again on the book. I know that our discussion here is focused on medical tourism internationally. I was also curious about medical tourism domestically. Are we also seeing, even though the sort of motivation for seeking affordable care might not be the same, are we also seeing that domestic medical tourism is rising? And if so, are there similar sort of secondary consequences like in Ghana, where we're having more and more brain drain from rural communities, and how is that affecting local institutions?
So it's a great question. There's not a lot of data on the subject. I can tell you though what I know from more anecdotal work. So first of all, you remember one of the points of Mitt Romney's alternative to the Affordable Care Act was to allow state insurance products to be sold across states, right? Had that gone through, I mean, again, there's an interesting set of questions, and Andre's an expert on this, but whether it was a good idea or not, and whether it really would have made a difference. But that was an attempt, I think, in some ways, to galvanize competition. You'll see in the US, if you look at like the Dartmouth Health Atlas, for example, you'll see an incredible heterogeneity, not so much between states, but even within states, in terms of the quality and the cost of the healthcare that's delivered. There is definitely a flow of patients for high-tech care and expertise. Mayo here in Boston, our wonderful hospitals. Elsewhere, the Cleveland Clinic, people go to those places when they can afford it, and when they really need something that's specialized. But my own experiences, and it may be different, I'm hoping to try and get at some point data between Providence and Boston. Because I think there might be some flow there. My own anecdotal experience is that there's very few people who will travel across state lines for more routine health care, in part because most of these people are relatively cost insensitive because of their insurance product. And the uninsured, the prices, if you're having trouble paying it in Boston, you're unlikely to have a strong enough cost discount or to be informed enough about the prices because you can't have access to be able to do that. In this way, the transparency of the international centers is far superior. You can't get to see the master charge. Nobody pays the master charge list anyways in the US, right? I don't know if you have different thoughts since you deal with this more directly.
No, I mean, I completely agree with everything you said. I mean, it's to the extent that, in our country, higher prices might actually be a false market signal for quality. People sometimes assume that our highest cost hospitals in Boston are the best hospitals simply because they're more expensive. So it's a tough nut to crack, and I think anecdotally that's absolutely true, that for routine care people are unwilling to travel across state lines, not only because of their relative lack of price sensitivity, but also because of this genuine sense of loyalty to their physicians. One of the sort of classic teachings about healthcare reform of any kind is that people are, no matter how fed up they are with the system, they tend to be very, very satisfied with their doctor.
And again, somebody who's more, has a slight libertarian streak and prefers choice architecture and all that good Cass Sunstein stuff over mandating things. The data on healthcare information and its take up by patients is truly alarming, right? People are offered 2 health insurance products together that cover less than 1 product. They will take the 2 of them together because it looks more because they're stacking it. People are given report card data directly and asked to look at it, showing that a particular hospital is less good than another particular hospital on cardiac data, and they will still privilege word of mouth and the friendliness of the professionals and the color and paint in the waiting room over that data. Individuals are not good health decision makers, and they're even worse about insurance decision making.
Nave?
I thought I heard a sort of pessimism or defeatism in Einer's comment regarding, say, how much we can do about the problem of brain drain, and if you try to close the borders, then there will be internal brain drain, there will be telemedicine, and at other points regarding the impact of medical tourism on local patients. WHO doesn't have teeth. What are we going to do? And I think we could develop better regulation, better governance of this sphere. We just need different tools than the traditional ones. I'll give 2 examples. In a chapter in the book, Thiel Bouninghausen and I discuss one tool to address medical brain drain, and that's a tool that Thiel explored in his doctoral work, conditioning medical studies funding on commitment to service in underserved settings later. So that's not just about staying in the country, it's really in those settings. And what we propose is you can expand this by many years. You can demand that people stay in underserved settings for many years, and it is likely to produce the same welcome results without, I think, generating serious ethical problems. Glenn mentioned medical tourism. You could, the WHO level, probably no hope. The sending countries might not have the right incentives. The local government in the destination country, it's illegal in India for many of the Apollo hospitals not to dedicate 10% of their beds to the local poor, and yet they do it because of global collective action problem. India doesn't want to raise prices so that Thailand would steal the workers, the tourists. But there are still other things that we could do. Maybe work with, I propose my work with the labeling that hospitals get for their quality, try to plug there some items for whether these hospitals are awful for the local population or okay for the local population, and then labeling the middleman organizations, labeling the insurers that work with those hospitals from the US, and trying to work on the reputational interests of these organizations more broadly. So there are just kind of new ways, more creative ways that we could try to deal with a changing problem, not necessarily a harder problem. So that also addresses Sue's comment on the kind of impossible to solve problems. Maybe not.
Right. Well, impossible to solve does not at all mean pessimism, because I'm super optimistic, as I gather you are. I don't know if you are or not, but I am, for the record. But I think that you make a great point, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware there's a commission on global governance for health that's wrapping up right now after a 2 to 3 year effort, and it involves the institutes involved. There's about 10 to 15 governments, but also a range of multilateral institutions, and it's looking at governance questions and potential solutions outside the health sector. So there's one issue of the plurality in the health sector and the weakening of the WHO, et cetera, et cetera. But the other, probably very important, relevant space, there's a lot going on. And while certain ideas might be distasteful, like some people like the idea of a prize fund or a global fund, but there's also a range of collective ideas. And if you think about, we sent people to space and we cooperate at that level. We have like that insect thing now where any insect you find anywhere in the world, like you can catalog the same way. There's many examples, tobacco, where we've found ways in the governance sphere. So I think that the idea of the paradigm shift, not who sets it, it's to keep the questions and framing open enough that the contributors to that conversation are a more equal group of participants than historically has led to this very North predominant viewpoint. So open question, optimism, broad range of being able to do a book with 1 million chapters where he hasn't answered one question completely.
So I guess the question was partly to me. The challenge I raise isn't really pessimism. I'm just trying to be realistic and sort of theoretically precise about it. And I think your interventions are helpful in that regard because as you listed them, they basically seem to me interferences with free trade and a Ricardian view once or another. So if you tell somebody, well, because you've got training, you must treat citizens of this nation rather than another nation, that's a barrier to free trade. And that itself, if that's attractive, it suggests to me that the theory of comparative advantage isn't what's doing the work here, something else is doing the work. And I'm not sure I think in the long run, I think we're all going to be global citizens. So that's my utopian, quite optimistic view that will eventually, the more transportation costs, cultural barriers, technological barriers drop, the less distance there will be between us and people in other nations, so that it may be not that it's different if somebody's in India from the fact that they live in Fitchburg instead. They're still not right next to me, but they're still in some ways part of my community. So we have a question here.
Yes, thank you. I'm actually going to cheat a little bit because I'm going to ask you a question that you asked me not very long ago, which is, well, first of all, I think the book, which is fairly, I think, modest by legal terms in terms of size, I feel like
I'm in public health. Use pamphlets.
I feel like it's premised on the assumption that the people who are engaged in this process are engaging in it relatively voluntarily. That means that they want to go and find care somewhere else. And now, obviously, the issue of choice is always limited by a set of, the parameters that you set for that choice. But even then, to what extent does it become an issue when insurers don't say you can go to Singapore, but you have to go to Singapore, which is something we discussed, within the U.S. in our conversation. And I was wondering whether this is something that you see as a potential issue as it develops.
Yeah, so not so much in this book, but in other work I've done, we should probably finish after this question. I don't want to keep people too late. Here's where I think there's a couple of issues. So, and they're interesting actually. So one is just you might have this view, oh my God, that's distasteful, right? But then you say, how different is that to say staying in network versus going out of network or paying extra, so the existing HMO and PPO structure. And you might say, how are these different? I mean, one thing would be there was a robust market where we priced the plans differently, and you could either always have access to a domestic physician, or in some cases you'd have to go abroad to get coverage. You might think that's actually welfare enhancing for some people who are more comfortable about it. So there is a good side. What's here is there's a pre-commitment problem to some extent, in that you may be worried that at the time when you enroll in your insurance product, especially if the insurance product is a long-run product, you may not have an accurate sense both of your own health needs and of how your views about foreign possible places. There's information asymmetry problem here, in that you may not have inaccurate information about the kinds of places they're going to send you. They may be in flux. And there's also an agency problem here, that you might worry that the insurers or your employer, who's in some ways predetermining to some extent what you're offered, is going to get in the way. On the other hand, there is the possibility, as compared to the person who's paying out of pocket and making their own choice. So first of all, you always have that option. Even if you have the insurance plan that requires you to go abroad, nothing's going to forbid you from paying a doctor privately in the US. So there's a way in which you retain that option. There is also the possibility that the information asymmetry is to some extent improved rather than harmed by the insurer relation, because the insurer has more of an incentive and more ability to have the relevant pieces of information than does the individual paying out of pocket. And in terms of the agency problem, it may not be in your best interest. Here, actually, it's true that about 21.54% of, I think that's the right number, it's close to that, of insured individuals switch insurers every year, which means that the insurers don't have a long-term interest in their health. So that's bad. That's creating an agency problem. On the plus side, your employer may have more of an incentive in your health than you do to some extent, in that they pay for the sick days, they pay for the missed days, they pay for communicable diseases and the like. So that may partially mitigate the agency problem if we think that they're going to internalize bad choices of your health. This is just to say that I think most people have a knee-jerk reaction. This would be the worst thing they could possibly imagine, an insurance product that required you to go abroad, right? And I think, by the way, no insurance product currently in the US looks like this. The most we're seeing is positive incentives like deductibles and rebates, right? But you might also think, and even more so for a socialized medicine group, if it turns out that for the NHS you get very high quality care and it's cheaper to send people abroad, and as a result of doing that, and let's imagine, because Nira and I would be concerned about what the effect is on the destination country, that there we're also remunerating, so everybody's made better off, you might think that actually there is an obligation to send people abroad if the sense is that by doing so you can help cover more of your population. So this is to say that I think the issues are hard here, and our initial reactions to them may not always be where we arrive after reflection. And it also depends a lot on the trust we have for different institutions. Insurance companies are one of the least trusted and least liked institutions in America. We may not trust the government either on Medicaid or on Medicare. But if you're in a different country with different politics of health and different relationship where citizens feel governance over these areas, you might come to a very different conclusion.
Well, congratulations on the book, and thank you for all our panelists for